Hello, y'all, and welcome to another video of Night Reads with Kali. I am Kali, and I am here with another bedtime read, another interesting book, another theory to boggle your mind. And before I get into it, please feel free to hit the subscribe button. I put out videos every week. I'm trying to put out more night read videos more frequently, but I also have some other stuff in the works that's coming up soon, so be on the lookout for that. You can also hit the notification button that's down below where you can get notified every time a video does come out if you want to know when my night read videos come out. So tonight I'll be reading preliminary materials for a theory of the young girl. I swear, y'all, this is literally my favorite book. Like it literally. I would say it has a tie at the number one spot with another book called The Timeless Way of Building. That I will be reading the introduction to y'all for that one too. I think I'm gonna do that one next. But this book, and that book are my absolute favorites, and I finished reading this book in 2 days. I literally swallowed it whole, and at the time I was also following this incredible sex worker on Twitter and starting to really unpack body politics, gender politics, things like that. I feel like this was like from 2018 to 2020, and I came across this book in 2019. I actually think I got it at, is it the Jackson bookstore in Soho in New York. And this MIT Press series, the semiotext intervention series, the entire series is just so well curated and so thought-provoking, and I feel like every human being alive should read this series. And I know I literally say that about every book, but I mean it when I'm talking about this series. Um the writing it's graspable. It's not like insanely academic, but it's also written by scholars who have done so much work in the fields that they have written about. And if you're curious about the topics that come up in this series, um it's so far left you might fall off the horseshoe, but it is so important to be thinking about these things and thinking about demolishing the entire horseshoe. Um, and I feel like I give bits and pieces of myself here and there online. I do want to be careful um, for my own safety, but those who know. Um, I am literally so obsessed with this book. I do not want to waste a second longer. The intro is pretty long, so we'll see how long it goes, but I do want to say that I might get into a few pages just because it is so, oh, it's so well written. So this book is written by Tiqqun. Tiqqun. I'm not sure how to pronounce it. I learned recently that Tiqqun is a group of writers who have come together to publish this. So it's not a single author, and I believe it has been translated from French. Um, I feel like so many of the books I read to y'all are just translated from French, but that seems to be that seems to be what I've been studying for a while now. So it keeps coming up and I don't know why. And I really don't do it consciously, but it just happens. I've literally read this like 15 to 20 times at least, and I've bookmarked it and I've underlined it, and this is probably one of the most important things in my possession right now. So I'm really, really happy to be sharing it with y'all. Preliminaries. Behind the hypnotic grimace of official pacification, there is a war being waged. A war that can no longer merely be called economic, social, or humanitarian. It has become total. Although everyone senses that their existence has become a battlefield upon which neuroses, phobias, somatizations, depression, and anxiety each sound a retreat, nobody has yet really grasped what is happening or what is at stake. Paradoxically, it is the total nature of this war, total in its means no less than its ends, that has allowed it to remain invisible. Rather than open offensives, empire prefers more intricate methods, chronic preventative measures, the molecular diffusion of constraint into everyday life. The molecular diffusion of constraints into everyday life. Here, internal police conveniently takes over for general policing, individual self-control for social control. Ultimately, it's the omnipresence of the new police that has made the war undetectable. What is at the stake in the current war are forms of life, which is to say, for empire, their selection, management, and attenuation. The stranglehold of spectacle over the public expression of desires, the biopolitical monopoly on all medical power, knowledge, the restraints placed on all deviance by an army, ever better equipped with psychiatrists, coaches, and other benevolent facilitators, the aesthetico-police booking of each individual according to her or his biological determinations. The ever more imperative and detailed surveillance of behavior. The proscription by common accord against violence. All this enters into the anthropological project, or rather, the anthropotechnical project of empire. It is a matter of profiling citizens. Evidently, impeding the expression of forms of life not as something that would mold a material from the outside, material that would otherwise remain formless, bare life, but rather as that which affects every body in situation with a certain tendency. An intimate motion does not result from a pure politics of repression. A whole imperial project of diversion, interference, and polarization of bodies centered on absences and impossibilities is at work. The impact is less immediate but also more durable. Over time, and via so many combined effects, they ultimately obtain the desired disarmament. In particular, immunodisarmament of bodies. The vanquished in this war are not so much citizens as those who, denying its reality, have capitulated from the outset. What they allow the vanquished, in the guise of existence, is now nothing but a lifelong struggle to render oneself compatible with empire. But for the others, for us, every gesture, every desire, every effect encounters, at some distance, the need to annihilate empire and its citizens. A question of letting passions breathe in their fullness. Following this criminal path, we have the time. Nothing obliges us to seek out direct confrontation. That would be proof of weakness. Assaults will be launched, however, assaults which will be less important than the position from which they originate. For our assaults undermine empire's forces just as our position undermines its strategy. Accordingly, the more empire will seem to be accumulating victories, the deeper it will bury itself in defeat, and the more irredeemable the defeat will be. Imperial strategy consists first of organizing the blindness of forms of life and their illiteracy when it comes to ethical differences, of rendering the battlefield difficult to distinguish, if not invisible, and in the most critical cases, of masking the real war in all manner of false conflicts. Retaking the offensive for our side is a matter of making the battlefield manifest. The figure of the young girl is a vision machine conceived to this effect. Some will use it to account for the massive character of hostile occupation forces in our existences. Others, more vigorous, will use it to determine the speed and direction of their advance. What each of us does with this vision machine will show what we're worth. Listen, the young girl is obviously not a gendered concept. A hip-hop nightclub player is no less a young girl than a barrette, tarted up like a porn star. The resplendent corporate advertising retiree who divides his time between the Côte d'Azur and his Paris office, where he still likes to keep an eye on things, is no less a young girl than the urban single woman too obsessed with her consulting career to notice she's lost 15 years of her life to it. And how could we account, if the young girl were a gendered concept, for the secret for and how could we account if the young girl were a gendered concept for the secret relationship between ultra-trendy, muscle-bound Marais homos and the Americanized petite bourgeoisie happily settled in the suburbs with their plastic families? In reality, the young girl is simply the model citizen as redefined by consumer society since World War I, in explicit response to the revolutionary menace. As such, the young girl is a polar figure, orienting rather than dominating outcomes. At the beginning of the 1920s, capitalism realized that it could no longer maintain itself as the exploitation of human labor if it did not also colonize everything that is beyond the strict sphere of production. Faced with the challenge from socialism, capital too would have to socialize. It had to create its own culture, its own leisure, medicine, urbanism, sentimental education, and its own mores, as well as a disposition towards their perpetual renewal. This was the Fordist compromise. The welfare state, family planning, social democratic capitalism. For a somewhat limited submission to labor, since workers still distinguish themselves from their work, we have today substituted integration through subjective and existential conformity, that is, fundamentally through consumption. The formal domination of capital has become more and more real. Consumer society now seeks out its best supporters from among the marginalized elements of traditional society. Women and youth first, followed by homosexuals and immigrants. To those who were minorities yesterday and who have therefore been the most foreign, the most spontaneously hostile to consumer society, not having yet been bent to the dominant forms of integration, the latter ends up looking like emancipation. Young people and their mothers, recognized Stuart Ewan, had been the social principles of the consumer ethic. Young people, because adolescence is the period of time with none but a consumptive relation to civil society. Women, because it is the sphere of reproduction over which they still reign, that must be colonized. Hypostasized youth and femininity, abstracted and recoded into youthitude and femininitude, find themselves raised to the rank of ideal regulators of the integration of the imperial citizenry. The figure of the young girl combines these two determinations into one immediate, spontaneous, and perfectly desirable whole. The tomboy comes to impose herself as a modernity more stunning than all the stars and starlets that so rapidly invaded the globalized imaginary. Albertine, encountered on the seawall of a resort town, arrives to infuse her casual and pansexual vitality into the crumbling universe of Marcel Proust's In Search of Lost Time. The schoolgirl lays down the law in Witold Gombrowicz. The schoolgirl lays down the law in Witold Gombrowicz's Verdidirk. A new figure of authority is born, and she outclasses them all. At the present hour, humanity, reformatted by the spectacle and biopolitically neutralized, still thinks it's fooling someone by calling itself citizen. Women's magazines breathe new life into a nearly 100-year-old wrong by finally offering their equivalent to males. All the old figures of patriarchal authority, from statesmen to bosses and cops, have become young girlified. Every last one of them, even the Pope. Among its many signs, we recognize that the new physiognomy of capital, only an inkling in the interwar years, has now attained perfection. Once its fictive character is generalized, the anthropomorphosis of capital becomes a fait accompli. Then the mysterious spell is revealed, thanks to which the generalized credit that rules every exchange, from banknotes to mortgage payments, from labor or marriage contracts to human and familial relations, from education and the diplomas and careers that follow, to the promises of all ideologies. All exchanges are now exchanges of dilatory appearances. Strikes with the image of its uniform emptiness, the heart of darkness of every personality and every character. This is how capitalist people increase. Just when every ancestral distinction seems to be disappearing, and every specificity of class or ethnicity, it's a fact that doesn't cease to amaze that the naive, who still think with their gaze lost in the past. The young girl appears as the culminating point of this anthropomorphosis of capital, the process of valorization. In the imperial phase is no longer simply capitalist. It coincides with the social. Integration into this process, which is no longer distinct from integration into imperial society, and which no longer rests on any objective base, requires that every person permanently self-valorize. Society's final moment of socialization, empire, is thus also the moment when each person is called upon to relate to themselves as value. That is, according to the central mediation of a series of controlled abstractions. The young girl would thus be the being that no longer has any intimacy with herself except as value, and whose every activity, in every detail, is directed to self-valorization. At each moment, she affirms herself as the sovereign subject of her own reification, the unquestionable character of her power, all of the crushing assurance of this flattened being, woven exclusively by the conventions, codes, and representations fleetingly in effect, all the authority that the least of her gestures incarnates, all of this is immediately indexed to her absolute transparency to society. Precisely because of her nothingness, each of her judgments carries the imperative weight of the entire social order, and she knows it. The theory of the young girl does not simply emerge fortuitously when the genesis of the imperial order is complete and begins to be apprehended as such. That which emerges is nearing its end, and in its turn, the young girl party will have to break up. As the young girlist formatting becomes more widespread, competition hardens and the satisfaction linked to conformity wanes. A qualitative jump becomes necessary. It becomes urgent to equip oneself with new and unheard of attributes. One must move into some still virgin space. Hollywood sorrow, the political consciousness of TV news, vague neo-Buddhist spirituality, or any engagement in some consciousness-soothing collective enterprise should do the trick. Thus is born, bit by bit, the organic young girl. The struggle for the survival of young girls is from then on identified with the necessity to overcome the industrial young girl, with the necessity to move on to the organic young girl. Contrary to her predecessor, the organic young girl no longer displays the urge for some kind of emancipation, but rather a high security obsession with conservation. For empire has been undermined at its foundations and must defend itself against entropy. Having attained the fullness of its hegemony, it can now only collapse. The organic young girl would thus become responsible, ecological, in solidarity, maternal, reasonable, natural, respectful, more self-controlled than falsely liberated. In a word, fiendishly biopolitical. She would no longer mimic excess, but rather moderation in all things. As we see, when the evidence of the young girl attains the force of cliché, the young girl is already out of date. At least in her primitive aspect of obscenely sophisticated mass production. It is at this critical moment of transition that we enter the fray. So as not to give a false impression, which could well be our intention, The jumble of fragments that follows does not in any way constitute a theory. These are materials accumulated by chance encounter, by frequenting and observing young girls, pearls extracted from magazines, expressions gleaned out of order under sometimes dubious circumstances. They are assembled here under approximate rubrics, just as they were published in Tiqqun 1. There was no doubt they needed a little organization. The choice to expose these elements in all their incompleteness, in their contingent original state, in their ordinary excess, knowing that, if polished, hollowed out, and given a good trim, they might together constitute an altogether presentable doctrine. We have chosen just this once trash theory. The cardinal ruse of theoreticians resides, generally, in the presentation of the result of their deliberations, such that the process of deliberation is no longer apparent. We figure that, faced with Bloom-esque fragmentation of attention, this ruse no longer works. We have chosen a different one. In these scattered fragments, spirits attracted to moral comfort or vice, in need of condemning, will find only roads leading nowhere. It is less a question of converting young girls than of mapping out the dark corners of the fractalized front line of young girlization. And it is a question of furnishing arms for a struggle, step by step, blow by blow, wherever you may find yourself. I'm going to read a few pages from the first chapter. I don't know what else to call it. Segment. The young girl as phenomena. The young girl is old insofar as she is known to be young. There is therefore no question for her of benefiting from this reprieve, which is to say, of committing the few reasonable excesses, of experiencing the few adventures expected of people her age. And all this with an eye to the moment when she will have to settle down into the ultimate void of adulthood. Thus, during the time it takes for youth to decay, social law contains its own violations, which are in the end just exemptions. The young girl is obsessed with authenticity because it is a lie. The masculine young girl is paradoxical in that she's the product of a sort of alienation by contagion. Although the feminine young girl appears as the incarnation of a certain alienated masculine imaginary, there is nothing imaginary about the alienation of this incarnation. It is altogether concretely that she has eluded those whose fantasies she populates in order to face and dominate them. As the young girl emancipates herself, blossoms and multiplies, the dream turns into an all-consuming nightmare. It's at this point that her former slave returns to tyrannize yesterday's master. In the end, we witness an ironic epilogue in which the male sex becomes both the victim and the object of its own alienated desire. I want people to be beautiful. The young girl is the figure of the total and sovereign consumer. She carries herself as such in every domain of existence. The young girl knows so very well the value of things. Often, before her decay has become too obvious, the young girl gets married. The young girl is only good for consuming. Pleasure or work, it doesn't matter. The intimacy of the young girl, now equivalent to all intimacy, has become something anonymous and exterior. an object. The young girl never creates anything. All in all, she only recreates herself. By investing young people and women with an absurd symbolic surplus value, by making them the exclusive carriers of the two new kinds of esoteric knowledge proper to the new social order, consumption and seduction, spectacle has effectively emancipated the slaves of the past, but it has emancipated them as slaves. The most extreme banality of the young girl is to take her or himself for an original. The stunted quality of the young girl's language, although it implies an incontestable narrowing of the field of experience, in no way constitutes a practical handicap, because it was not made to talk with, but rather to please and to repeat. Chatter, curiosity, equivocation, hearsay, the young girl incarnates the fullness of improper existence, whose categories Heidegger identified. The young girl is a lie, whose apogee is the face. When Spectacles proclaims that woman is the future of man, it is naturally speaking of the young girl, and the future it predicts recalls only the worst cybernetic slavery. No kidding! The young girl manages to live with a dozen unarticulated concepts as her only philosophy that immediately become moral categories, meaning that the whole of her vocabulary can be definitely reduced to the good and evil binary. It goes without saying that in order to consider the world, it must be sufficiently simplified, and in order to permit her to live in it happily, the world must make many martyrs, starting with herself. Highly visible physical imperfections, even if they have no effect on aptitude for work, weaken people socially, transforming them into the involuntary invalids of work. This is in quotes by Dr. Julius Moses. Unquote. In the young girl, what is sweetest is also the cruelest. Did I say unquote, end quote, end quote, end quote? In the young girl, what is sweetest is also the cruelest. What is most natural is most fiend. What is most human is most machine-like. Adolescence is a recent category created according to the demands of mass consumption. The young girl invariably calls happiness everything to which they chain her. The young girl is never simply sad. She is also sad that she's sad. Ultimately, the young girl's ideal is domestic. Bloom is the crisis of classic sexuation, and the young girl is the offensive by which market domination has responded to this crisis. There is no more chastity in the young girl than there is debauchery. The young girl simply lives as a stranger to her desires, whose coherence is governed by her market-driven superego. The ennui of abstraction flows into this. Come. There is nothing, neither poetry nor ethnology, neither Marxism nor metaphysics, that the young girl cannot fit into the closed horizon of her vapid quotidian. Damn, with the Marxism and metaphysics, I feel so called out. I'm gonna throw up. There is nothing, neither poetry nor ethnology, neither Marxism nor metaphysics, that the young girl cannot fit into the closed horizon of her vapid quotidian. Albertine comes from nowhere, and is very modern in that way. She flutters, comes and goes, From her absence of attachments, she derives the instability and the unpredictable quality which give her power of freedom. Jacques Dubois for Albertine, Proust and the Sense of the Social. That's a quote. When it addresses itself distinctly to the young girl, the spectacle is not above a bit of bathmology. This is why the entire significance of boy bands and girl bands comes from making a show of the very fact of making a show. The lie consists here, by means of crude irony, in presenting as a lie what is on the contrary the truth of the young girl. The young girl is struck by sudden vertigo whenever the world stops revolving around her. The young girl sees herself as the holder of a sacred power, the power of commodities. I love children. They're beautiful, honest, and they smell good. That was a quote. The mother and the whore, as Winninger understands them, are equally present in the young girl. But the one hardly renders her any more worthy of praise than the other makes her worthy of blame. In fact, over time, a curious reversibility between the two can be observed. The young girl is fascinating in the manner of all things that exhibit a closing in on themselves, a mechanical self-sufficiency, or an indifference to the observer, like the insect, the infant, the automaton, or Foucault's pendulum. Why must the young girl always feign some activity or other? To remain unassailable in her passivity. The freedom of the young girl rarely goes beyond the ostentatious cults of the most pathetic of the spectacle's productions. Essentially, it consists in opposing a lack of zeal with the necessities of alienation. The future of the young girl, the name of a group of communist girls organized in the southern suburbs of Paris in 1936 for the entertainment, education, and the defense of their interests. The young girl wants to be desired without love or loved without desire. There is no threat in either case to her unhappiness. The young girl has love stories. It is enough to recall what she classifies as adventure to get a good idea of just how much the young girl fears the possible. The old age of the young girl is no less hideous than her youth. From one end to the other, her life is nothing but a progressive shipwreck in formlessness, and never an irruption of becoming. The young girl wallows in the limbo of time. As for the face of the young girl, differences in age, like difference in gender, are insignificant. There is no age to be struck by youthitude, nor is there a gender that forbids itself a dash of femininitude. Just like the magazines they intend for her, and which she devours so painfully, the life of the young girl is divided and organized into so many columns between which the greatest separation reigns. The young girl is that which, being only this, scrupulously obeys the authoritarian distribution of roles. Love for the young girl is just autism for two. What they continue to call virility is nothing more than the infantilism of men and femininity of infantilism of women. Moreover, perhaps one ought to speak of virilism and of feminism when so much voluntarism is mixed into the acquisition of an identity. The same disabused stubbornness that characterized the traditional woman assigned to the home with the duty of ensuring survival blossoms at present in the young girl, now emancipated from the domestic sphere and from all sexual monopoly. She will from now on express herself everywhere, in her irreproachable effective impermeability at work, in the extreme rationalizations she imposes on her emotional life, in her every step so spontaneously military, in the way she fucks, carries herself, or taps away on her computer, which is no different from the way she washes her car. One piece of information that I obtained in a well known Berlin department store is particularly instructive. This is a quote. When taking on sales and office staff, says an influential gentleman from the personnel department, we attach most importance to a pleasant appearance. From a distance, he looks a bit like Reinhold Schunzel in early films. I ask him what he understands by pleasant. Saucy or pretty? Not exactly pretty. What's far more crucial is, oh, a morally pink complexion. I do know. A morally pink complexion. This combination of concepts at a stroke renders transparent the everyday life that is fleshed out by window displays, salary earners, and illustrated papers. Its morality must have a pink hue. Its pink, a moral grounding. That is what the people responsible for selection want. They would like to cover life with a varnish concealing its far from rosy reality. But beware, if morality should penetrate beneath the skin and the pink be not quite moral enough to prevent the eruption of desires. The gloom of unadorned morality would bring as much danger to the prevailing order as a pink that began to flare up immorally. So that both may be neutralized, they are tied to one another. The same system that requires the aptitude test also produces this nice, friendly mixture, and the more rationalization progresses, the more the morally pink appearance gains ground. It is scarcely too hazardous to assert that in Berlin a salaried type is developing, standardized in clothes, gestures, and countenances become assimilated, and the result of the process is that very same pleasant appearance, which with the help of photographs can be widely reproduced. A selective breeding that is carried out under the pressure of social relations and that is necessarily supported by the economy through the arousal of corresponding consumer needs. Employees must join in, whether they want to or not. The rush to the numerous beauty salons springs partly from existential concerns, and the use of cosmetic products is not always a luxury. For fear of being withdrawn from use as obsolete, ladies and gentlemen dye their hair, while 40-year-olds take up sports to keep slim. How Can I Become Beautiful runs the title of a booklet recently launched onto the market. The newspaper advertisements for it say that it should show ways to look young and beautiful both now and forever. Fashion and economy work hand in hand. Most people, of course, are in no position to consult a specialist. They fall prey to the quacks or have to make do with remedies as cheap as they are dubious. For some time now, the above-mentioned deputy, Dr. Moses, has been fighting in their interest in Parliament for incorporating proper provision of disfigurement into Social Security. The young working community of cosmetic practitioners of Germany has associated itself with this legitimate demand. The loss of metaphysical direction is not distinct in the young girl from the loss of the sensory, in which the extreme modernity of her alienation is verified. The young girl moves in the oblivion of being, no less than in that of the event. The young girl resembles her photo. Okay, so I am ending on page 33. Honestly, I think the main joy of reading this book is this kind of these very different fonts that they put these little collagey bits of theory into. And so honestly, to really fully experience this book, I would recommend purchasing a copy. There are a few secondhand copies available on thrift books if you would like to buy nothing new, which is something I am practicing with books recently. And um, I mean, I just always prefer a used book over a new print. Um, let's recirculate our materials and the resources we have. And with that, I will end this video and leave y'all from here. I hope you have a good night. I hope you got good sleep, and I will see you in the next one. Bye for now.